Kadosh, Kadosh, Echad Yisrael, Baruch Shem.
It's wonderful to be with you today. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here on Answers with Our Time. And I'm your host, Jessica Knock. Today is a really significant day. I am excited about the program, about Dr. Stephen Pidgeon and the content and our guests that they are bringing here today. Before I go into that, I just want to say this, and that is, I want to just pay a special mention to Stuart Birch, who you all know is our moderator. Him and his wife, they are so supportive of this minister, and they're such pillars. Angela released Stu on his day off to come to our home, to our office here, and just fix the computer with all the errors that it had and such, so that we could be ready for tonight's broadcast and the future broadcasts. They built this computer. His son has built our website, and it's a work in process, because when you do it from scratch, it's line by line. I've discovered an error will come and you have to fix it. But when Yah calls you and you walk in obedience, then he brings the family, he brings the people together. And that's what has happened here. Just to see him at work, his family at work and serving in this way, it really couldn't be done without them. So I just want to give a special mention to the Birch family, because they're just absolutely tremendous in how they have got this platform going, how they help me technically to keep it going. They do so much behind the scenes, and we're just family. And that's what this is about, having extended family in these prophetic times. I don't need to say much today because there is so much content and I'm excited about it. Thank you for your correspondence throughout the last couple of weeks. You're all saying thank you for echoing what we have been going through for the last 3 years. You make us feel like we're not suffering in silence, but you're actually verbalizing what we've had to hide from others, but you're showing that it was not for anything, but you count that cost, you walk with us, and we walk with you in this. And today is no different. It's really exciting because, I've named it, well, actually, Malcolm, the person who is putting the slides together, surely we need to have answers for fundamental questions. And, when you get into what he's discussing and what he's bringing to the floor, you will understand what I mean. But for this last 3 years, especially, so many of us have become a company of people where we have understood that the narrative that is being said is not so, that there is more to it. All of you have realized that we are coming in prophetic times, and all of you have seen that we have been duped. Now, it's really difficult to say, I've been duped, that you've been deceived. One, you've got to admit it. And two, then it's coming to a realization. And that process is faster for some, slower for some, and it's difficult. I understood at the beginning of this process that there were a company of people with a Hebrew understanding that could understand the word better and what was happening in this world. And without that Hebrew perspective, it's too difficult to understand what is happening. And then you brush it under the carpet and you can say, oh, you're reaching for a narrative to fit your perspective. But when you look into these things and you delve and you look at it this way, from this perspective, it's completely different. You begin to see how things have been changed. You can't just go on trust. And that's one of the most surprising things for so many of us in our community, that those in the leadership that thought of certain things this way and that way, it's not so. You have to test everything for yourself. We discovered that from the names of God, the sacred names, right through to actually how the word itself has been corrupted in certain chapters and certain verses. And today's focus is on the missing books. And that's what I'm excited about. And I know you are too. Why? Because, again, you see books like Enoch and Ezra, that they fill in the void and the gap for the period that we are in now. They were written for this appointed time for us to open up. And with that, that's why our first guest, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, he's on a feat on his own with what he does. He absolutely translating, welcome Dr. Pidgeon, the Sefer Bible into the original Hebrew that he believes that, and that he's showing us it was written in. But not only that, boldly proclaiming the correct names. Not only that, but including the forgotten, the lost books that others would say are just history. They have no right to be in the canon. That's a really brave thing to do, because it's an ongoing quest of commendable and a fight and a rebuke. But we need it because it's for a company of people for this time. So, I had a fresh breath of realization and appreciation, Stephen, just realizing how much of a price your team had to pay to do this. It wasn't just sacrificial financially, in so many other ways, and also with reputation, but you do it for Yah, you do it for his kingdom, you do it for truth, and you do it for the time set before us now, because there is a short time and it must get out to those that will hear, so.
I remember, Jesse, when we first presented the Sefer, we went to a large church in Redmond, Washington, and they were having a big forum, and we walked in with the Sefer, and the very first question that was asked to me, the guy walked up, he took a look at the book, and he said, "Aren't you afraid you're going to burn in hell for doing what you've done here?" And I was having the discussion with him. He was rebuking me. And another fellow walked up next to him who was Ethiopian. And he took one look at the book and went, "Oh, no, this is right downtown." So, the Ethiopian Bible has 92 books. So I'm not afraid of this book at all. Not, not the slightest. But you're right. We suffered immediately, a condemnation, expulsion. And people saying, and I can remember going to churches where they'd see me come in. I didn't think they knew me from Adam, frankly. I was a stranger in church, just some stranger walking in, but they knew me. And the pastor would be rebuking me from the pulpit, have nothing to do with these people.
Goodness.
Nothing to do with these people, because they're trying to join their legalism, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And of course, we've had people, a fellow there in southwestern Britain actually burned the Sefer in his wood stove and made a video of it, because he didn't think Acts 29 was appropriate. Something in Acts 29 that he didn't like, and so he burned the book. And I had another fellow in Alberta, Canada, call me up and tell me, "I'm burning your book." I said, "Why are you burning the book?" "Because you've said that neither eunuchs nor bastards have any place in the kingdom of heaven. And I've had a vasectomy and I was born out of wedlock." And I said, "Well, you've got a lot of books to burn, because that's in every Bible."
I remember you saying this. Yeah.
But
Wow.
we suffered a great deal, and we still suffer condemnation. There are people who, take me apart online, and videos out there calling the Sefer heresy and the worst translation, and these people are idiots, and so on and so forth, and they go on and on and on and on. But it doesn't stop us from trying to achieve excellence.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which is part of the reason why we've been talking with Malcolm. When we met Malcolm, when I met Malcolm online initially, but when he arrived at Lutterworth, he had so much information to share. And I mean, it was like, of course, drinking from a fire hose. The presentation today, but Malcolm and I have a little bit to talk about. There's a couple of things in the record that that I want to point out, namely concerning the Codex Sinaiticus. But we're going to see that the historic record is something that has been altered primarily by the Westminster Confession. Okay, the Westminster Confession distorted the entire faith. The faith prior to the Westminster Confession was a faith that was predicated upon the entire canon, which included the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
And all of the Great English Bible, Coverdale's work, which we were celebrating the whole time we were here, going to York to see the site of Coverdale's birth, but and being in Lutterworth where Wycliffe had done his work, Coverdale was really the most instrumental man in the history of the English text. He worked with Tyndale. He published the Great Bible himself in 1539. He worked with John Calvin to bring the 1560 Geneva. And Miles Coverdale, covered much ground. And in his covering of the ground, of course, he included the Apocrypha in the Great Bible, the Great English Bible. This was the Bible that preceded the 1611 KJV AV. This was before that, and it did include the Apocrypha, as did the 1611 KJV.
Mm.
So when you see that, the work of Miles Coverdale, I thought, was just enormous. And Miles
Mm.
Coverdale had the blessing of Yah upon him because he suffered nothing. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say he suffered nothing. I'm sure he had suffering in his own life. But compared to Tyndale, who made the mistake of stepping into Catholic Europe during this period of time, and as soon as they caught him, they hanged him and then burned him at the stake. And Coverdale was able to escape that kind of fate. And he ended up, for a brief period of time, being appointed the Bishop of Exeter. And he was the bishop in Exeter, which, as you know, is in Cornwall. He was the bishop in Exeter for 2 years before he
Yeah.
moved back to London. And he lived out the rest of his life in London, having successfully translated and really put a milestone, if you will, in English literature by establishing the Great Bible that would become an enduring text
Yeah.
for all of Britain and really for all of the English-speaking world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so with that, but you have to remember that Miles Coverdale did not have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, nor had the 29th chapter of the Book of Acts been discovered. Remember,
Yes,
Miles Coverdale
good
worked
point.
in the 1500s, and this 29th chapter of the Book of Acts would not be discovered until 150 years later.
Yeah.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls 250 years later. So,
Oh, wow.
you had, and in addition to that, there was very little discussion about the Book of Hanok or the Book of Jubilees, for that matter, because they had gone completely, outside the scope of British thinking. They were contained only in the Ethiopian text or the Assyriac text or the Eritrean text. And so as a result, no one had translated them. Even to this day, you will have a difficulty getting an English translation of the entirety of the Ethiopian Bible.
Very sad.
They'll give you the 66 book canon, but they won't give you the whole book, all 92 texts. And so as a result, it was the work of D.H. Lawrence in the early 1800s, again, 300 years after Coverdale had published the Great Bible, that we see for the first time an English translation of Hanok. And the first time we see an English translation of Yov Helim or Jubilees. Didn't happen until the 19th century. And so as a consequence, what were the English interpreters going to use at the time of the translation, right? Now, Malcolm is going to talk about this history extensively. We're going to be able to dig into what exactly happened before we arrive at the creation of the New Testament. And we're going to see the work that's been done, who did it, when they did it, how it was done. And we're going to get some idea of what took place. Now, for some people, this is going to be a shaking of the tree of their faith. Dr. Michael Heiser, he talks about this. He says, you get into seminary and they start talking about the creation of the books, and pretty soon, you're walking out an atheist. Well, there's no reason to walk out an atheist from this, but you do need to have some discerning understanding that these texts, what we have, are received texts. There are no originals.
That's shocking. When you understand what you've just said, that's really shocking.
Yeah. And, and when you understand also that the Greek text was formulated from, now this is our belief, right? We believe this foundationally, and there's historic record to support the fact that the Gospels were conceived in Hebrew. And that there were other works in the New Testament that were conceived in Hebrew. Now they were transitioned into Greek, but they were conceived in Hebrew. And this has been our position at the Sefer all along, that the New Testament had ultimately a conception in Hebrew. Not all of it. Did you know that the book of 2 Timothy, for instance, does not appear in the Greek record at all until the 5th century?
Wow. No.
There's no appearance of it at all until the 5th century. And, so when we talk about this, and even though the Peshitta in the Aramaic text claims to have an origin in the 2nd century, the first known source of the Peshitta is 5th century, the Aramaic New Testament, right? So all of these things become kind of, okay, well, this is going to be interesting. It's an interesting mix that puts together the question of what exactly is the text.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
one other thing I want to address here before we move into our discussion with Malcolm has to do with the issue of the inspired word. Now, people say to me, that's not the inspired word of God.
All the time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fourth Ezra is not the inspired word of God. Well, I beg to differ, and particularly where that book is concerned, or that the wisdom of Solomon is not the inspired word of Yah, or that the wisdom of Sirach is not the inspired word of Yah. I just beg to differ. And they want to claim it. And so I look at them and say, okay, well, what are the tenets, the premises, if you will, of what you use to claim that a book is the inspired word of Yah? What are those tenets that you use? Give me the protocol. I want the bullet points. Boom, 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 and boom. And then once you've done that, then I want you to show me how Philemon, written by Onesimus, the slave, to Philemon, his master, in the name of Paul, how does that book qualify as an inspired work? How does First Chronicles qualify as an inspired work? How does Second Kings qualify as an inspired work? These are questions that I'd like to know. And the difficulty is that no one has ever written this down. Oh, well, we claim that's not inspired. How do you claim that? Well, because the church fathers didn't think it was inspired. Oh, okay. So you're using the exact same reasoning the church fathers used in the 5th century, which is that's what those guys did. Therefore, that's what we're going to do. There's no other logistics to your level of inspiration in terms of these works. We know in the Tanakh, for instance, that there are 4 different categories in the Tanakh, right? The Tanakh is an acronym. It stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Okay. And so the Torah, the writings of Moshe, the Nevi'im, the writings of the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the writings, just the general writings. Now, there's an additional category inside that scripture, which is poetry, included in the acronym called the Tanakh. I'm sorry, we're getting kind of an intermittent something or other here going on, but it's okay though. But at any rate, when you see what that is, you can tell immediately that the ancient scholars believed that there were different categories of inspiration. Some categories were inspired prophecy, Nevi'im. Some were inspired writings, Ketuvim. Some were the inspired giving of the law, Torah, right? But when you see this, what you see is you see that, hey, guess what? There's different categories of inspiration. So what are you talking about? This is not the inspired work of Yah. You need to lay out some criteria. I mean, in the epistles of Paul, that one of the criticisms that comes out of the Jewish world concerning the writings of Paul is that Paul is giving nothing more than rabbinical opinion about the gospel. Now, this is not always the case, okay? Because Paul directly prophesies in first set of Thessalonians and then second Thessalonians. And he also gives an explicit prophecy, which we dealt with last week, in Acts 29. Prophecy, by the way, that just kind of blew my mind last week. I couldn't believe I was reading it out of Acts 29. Yeah. Because it's so on point as to what's happening in the UK right now. Very strong prophecy. And so with these prophecies, you do see a prophetic word from Paul. It's not just rabbinical opinion on the Gospels. But the rest of his epistles read like rabbinical opinion. I mean, you're reading Rav Shaul, the Rabbi Paul, as compared to reading Yochai or reading, Rambam or somebody else with a rabbinical opinion. You're seeing that you're getting not the text, but you're getting a review of the text. Here's what the text says, and this is what it means. That's rabbinical opinion, right?
Yes.
So, but we're going to say the rabbinical opinion of Paul expressed in the book of Romans or expressed in the book of 1 Timothy or expressed in the book of the epistle to the Ephesians or the Colossians or to the Philippians. These things are in the inspired word of Yah, right? Well, how does that differ from somebody pulling up the Talmud and saying the writings of Yochai and Akiva and Shammai and Hillel, these are the inspired words of Yah.
Mm.
Just because someone said so, just because Dallas Theological Seminary told you to say that?
Yeah, exactly. You've nailed it. Yeah. That's
You
at the heart of it, because you've been told, which is why I said we've also been duped. You know, you set a great foundation, Stephen. With that, I'm going to bring Malcolm David. Let's bring him on. Malcolm, a very wonderful welcome to you. You have become such a close connected to Stephen and Stephanie, Shane, and myself. You're personal friends with us. You know, we just love your knowledge and your zeal and your passion over the years. I know since 2019, you've been communicating with Stephen and sharing knowledge. And then just last month, maybe this time last month, in fact, you got to meet Stephen for the first time, and it connected, and both of you just throwing your knowledge at one another. It was exciting. That was one of the reasons I do believe that assembly came together last month, because there were so many like-minded people, all equipped or called in different areas, all stationed and together for that time. And now we have you here. And you're very humble, and yet you've achieved so much. But the best way that you like to be recognized is that you are an independent researcher. And you know, that independence, wow, you've just accumulated so much wealth and knowledge, and you're a gifted communicator. When we met yesterday, I just enjoyed the way you communicated, and I understood it, and I walked away and I could remember, have a precipice. Okay, this is how I have to understand it. So I know Stephen knows that you're just going to be wonderful for our viewers, who I always say are part of our fellowship and community extended rather than just viewers. So with that, a very warm welcome, and also to Shelley behind the scenes. She's very precious to all of us here too. Very big welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. That's a marvelous introduction. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me on your program and meeting with Dr. Pidgeon. As I said, I first contacted him in May and got hold of a copy of the etc. And I was just amazed that this was happening at this time. And I'd just like to explain. I mean, I came to this really from after retiring. I started looking at my faith and what I believed, and started to research truth. And the skill sets I had in my career really helped me in this, in identifying information, what was clearly misinformation and didn't appear to be quite correct. So I've come a long way really from about 2012 onwards, in a number of years research, looked at various religious groups and various meetings and things, and found all sorts of issues with them. And so we were very surprised. And my background really was, I was excited about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we went along to groups and asked them, well, how do these fit into the Bible? And nobody could give me an answer. And it was very, very strange. And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, well, there's something here that's got to be looked into on a deeper level. And that's really what prompted me to look further. So thank you for inviting me again. And I hope this is of interest to your viewers. I'm coming from a completely different background to Dr. P. I don't speak Hebrew. I don't even speak Greek. I speak English fairly well. But yeah, it's just really the ability to analyze information and try and get to a semblance of truth. So thank you for having me on, and I hope that your viewers find this interesting.
They will, and it's a pleasure. I'm excited. They will be excited. Just by reading the blurb, already the reaction is that they're very excited for this. So they want it, they need it. And this is just the start. You will be coming back to continue, because you can't do it all in one episode. So
no, there is a part two, and I really think we are at the beginning of a threshold of a new era of discovery.
Yes.
You know, this is the time when the books that Daniel was told to, keep the end of days, and I think this is really what's coming back now. And I think we are truly blessed. And I agree with everything you both said. Just a point on the inspired word, etc. I mean, we went along to different groups, and I asked them about the Apocrypha, because there must have been some relationship there to all these extra books on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we were told, oh, they're not inspired, you mustn't look at those. You've got to just focus on the 66 books. That's all you need to be saved. Don't worry about anything else. Just believe, and all sorts of answers like that. And to me, that wasn't enough. I wanted to know the real reason, because if you haven't got the foundational truth of what you're reading correct, how do you know what else is right or been changed? So that's really where we've come from. And I have to thank my wife Shirley. She's been an amazing researcher. She provides information out of thin air. Sometimes I'm looking for something and she'll suddenly wave a piece of paper in front of me, and I've been sort of running around for weeks trying to find this answer, and somehow she had it all along. So we've really been blessed, and you'll see in this talk, we've been to bookshops and charity shops looking at old religious books that people give away when they pass on, and we found so many things, little gems hidden away that nobody really wants. And literally, I can honestly say to you that everything we needed has come to us right just out of the blue. Now, if that's not the work of the art, I don't know what is.
Exactly.
So let's move in, and I'll show you a few things that I've discovered, and hopefully you'll see some truth in that as to what we're talking about today and why the Etc. is so important. Because it's you're the only person that's actually doing this for mankind, and I think that's a blessing.
So would you like Stuart to bring up slide 1?
Yes, go to slide 1. And as I said, most teachers actively avoid discussing this because either they don't really know the answer or it's too controversial. And that's what we found. Nobody could answer the question. And we even went along to seminars at Cambridge University, because you can bring them up. And if you want to go to a public seminar there, you're allowed to go in as a member of the public and sit and listen. And we went to lectures on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we talked offline to the lecturers and the professors. And again, there's like a blank wall. They didn't want to discuss this. And it got me even more intrigued. When somebody says something to that, I want to go even further to try and find the truth, because something's been hidden. So next slide. So the big question for us today was really, let's just keep up with you as well. Yeah. The Christianity is really founded on the Septuagint. All our belief goes back to this single document, and it's the earliest translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. And we got to be absolutely certain that that's the most reliable source, and we all understand completely what it is. But every theologian I've spoken to, they all have a different view. Some say it's the Old Testament, some say it's the Old Testament and the 14 intertestamental books. So there are different views in the wider world on what it is. And I think this is very important. And then how does that relate to the Dead Sea Scrolls? And why were these other books not included? Because when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, there wasn't one neat cave where all the Old Testament books were and another neat cave where all the Apocryphal books and the Deuterocanonical books were. They were all muddled up together and mixed in together. So they must have valued them all equally the same. And in terms of inspiration, the point about, oh, that's not inspired. If there's a painting on your wall and I walk up to it and I like it, I'm inspired by it. How can somebody tell me, oh, you mustn't be inspired by that? And that's what's been happening with these extra books. We are told they are not inspired. But whenever I've read them, I've been totally inspired, more so than any ever in my life. So this is more reason why these are very important for us.
It's very releasing what you're saying. So many people have been in condemnation about these books. So that's very releasing what you're saying. Thank you.
Next slide. All right. Sorry. Yes. So one of the things I wanted to be certain of was that what do we look at and what are the criteria? And we really have to say that anything which is written in Hebrew ought to take precedence over something written in Aramaic, Greek, or Latin, or even English, because this has to be the true source. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. And when there isn't a Hebrew source, you have to ask yourself why. Where's it gone? Who has it? Because it is there somewhere, and I'm quite certain they even exist today, and they will come back at some point. And we also have to consider that the Masoretic text, because most of the Old Testament Bibles that you have today are all based on this Masoretic text, which is 1,000 years after the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, all the comparisons I've heard, they say, oh, Isaiah's wonderful, word for word is the same as Isaiah. But then they don't go and tell you what about Enoch and these other books. That's all sort of kept quiet and forgotten about. So, it's up to us to really look into this to find out the truth. And I'm going to show you that I think there's indisputable evidence that this has been a Roman override.
That this has been what, Malcolm? Can you say that again?
A Roman overwrite. It's been overwritten.
Yeah.
Either overwritten or it's been, the contents have been changed.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So if we're looking at this group, we're really talking about these extra biblical books, which correlate to the time period of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's also this group in the intertestamental period, which is the 14 Deuterocanonical books if you're Catholic, or the Apocrypha if you're Protestant. So that covers that period in between. So our focus perhaps today is on both of these, but the second part is really the key to getting into the truth. So if we go to the next slide. And most lawyers I've come across seem to like timelines, because they like to map out where events occurred so that they can then look into how things unfolded and what happened when and where, and that's very important. So this is what I did, tried to map out the key points. And if you look at the Old Testament, that starts with Moses, which is that brown box vertically, and goes into the period up to the end of the millennium, if you like, or the time of Messiah. And then we've got this 400-year gap in between, which is the intertestamental books before the New Testament was written. So if you consider Genesis and Exodus, the time there, these are the 5 books of Moses. Well, Moses wasn't a primary witness. He wasn't there at the beginning. He didn't see that. And if you're in a court of law, a primary witness takes far greater precedence over a second-hand or a third-hand witness. And Moses existed 2,500 years later, from the very beginning. So this is even more important.
Yeah, very important point. And equally true, Malcolm, that when you read in the book of Deuteronomy, describes the death of Moshe. Well, that presents an interesting problem, because we know Moshe didn't write that part, right? And when you talk about the intertestamentary period, such an important point. I was reflecting on it last night a little bit on the, during our presentation, because in this intertestamentary period, you have a critical history concerning the Second Temple. And there's big questions about the credibility of the Second Temple. Was it, in fact, really a Second Temple? Did it function as a true temple? How long did it function as a true temple? What were the Levitical practices at the temple at that time? Was that temple modified and changed by Herod such that it became a third temple during the time of Herod? All of these things are large questions that no one in the 66 book canon world can answer, because they closed their mind at the end of Malachi. Now, there's something else I want to add too. You mentioned a point I think is very important, that people would tell you, you don't need to read those books. All you need for your salvation is these 66 books. Then you can get away with whatever else you want to do in life. You can get away with murder because you didn't read the additional books. It's like, how little do I need to do to get into heaven? Because that's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in following or being a person of faith or being someone who loves Yah. I just want to do the least amount possible to make sure I'm in heaven, and that's it. Then I want to go on with my life. I'll leave it to you.
It's a very good point. And I think it's a question of how has the word come to us, and we've grown up with Genesis and the books from then on for so long that we now need to start looking at what came before that and how does that tie in. And for example, that yellow line, obviously Adam knew Enoch, and Enoch was alive when Noah was around, and Noah took the books through the flood and gave them to Abraham at some point, or Seth. So there is a continuity link that goes right up to Moses. So I'm not saying Moses didn't have the truth or the story, but obviously things were proceed down in some respects. So in that particular book, there's a story, but there's a lot more to it, which you can, if you need to find out more, you can find out elsewhere. And that's really what this study is all about. So we're really focused on this period at the beginning, the extra biblical books, and how that relates to the Dead Sea Scrolls and what we've ended up with. Next slide. So one of the first things I did was to look at all the Bible sources and the texts that were available. This is not a comprehensive list. It covers all the ones that I could find. It covers most of them. You can see at the bottom, I've got the King James authorized version. Just hang on, let's get the same page here.
Now, one thing I wanted to point out on here, Malcolm, on this slide, you have the Codex Sinaiticus in here with its reputation of saying it was a very old codex. This is based on the testimony of Tischburn, who found the Codex Sinaiticus and said this is the oldest text in the world. However, there was a fellow named Constantine Simonides who published for 3 years in a row in the Manchester Guardian, I wrote it, I wrote it, I wrote it, I wrote it. And that's why they only found one copy. And they found it in a trash can with pages missing because the monks were using it to start fires with the pages out of the Codex Sinaiticus. But Tischburn was insistent. Oh, no, this is an ancient text. He was not even a professional archaeologist. He just went to this particular monastery, found the text, and wanted his reputation to come forward. And then the Codex Sinaiticus was made famous by Westcott and Hort, who then relied upon it for its New Testament. They relied upon the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which we know was a totally corrupted text, totally Roman overwrite. And this is how they created what we call the NIV today, or which is a paraphrase of that, or the ESV or the ASB or the NASB from the Codex Sinaiticus. But other than that, I agree with that. Historically, this is the timing that is claimed.
And the Vaticanus was, of course, produced by Eusebius, who was working for Constantine. So, yeah, how reliable is that? But the key point I wanted to explore was really that the Septuagint is the earliest source that we have, which is the top one in the white there, in the BC period, which is only available in Greek. So where's the Hebrew source gone? And the scholars all say, well, it's a lost text document. They all say there was a source document for the Septuagint, but nobody has it. So that then begs the question is, how does that relate to the Dead Sea Scrolls? And the only other information we had before that period is the information we have from Esdras, which we're going to come on to in a minute. And of course, Enoch and Noah and Seth, we have references there, how in the time of Enoch, he was the scribe to the Most High as well. So, and even the Arab world recognizes that he was the author of writing, or the first one to start writing things down. So, our job is really to try and see, are we fully content that the Septuagint is correct, and it's entirely correct in what we've been told? And I think I'm about to prove to you that it's not. Next slide, yes. But just a bit of history, because history is always important, because we have to put it in context. And at this time, after when the kingdom was divided into the north and south, of course, we had the Assyrians come in and take away the northern tribes, and then we had the Babylonians come in and take away the southern tribes. And of course, when they were taken away, there was a nice piece of real estate there with lots of empty buildings. And this is where the Edomites, or the Edomians, moved in from the southeast. And you can see that it then became called Judea and Edomia in the south. And of course, the Samaritans moved into the north. And the northern tribes never came back. For example, Tobit or Tobiah, who was from the tribe of Naphtali. So that may be one reason why that book wasn't included, because he wasn't part of Judah. So we need to have an eye on history to see what happened. But if you're being taken captive and you're being exiled off to Babylon as a slave, you don't have time to collect all your belongings together and take everything with you. You're lucky if you get out with your shirt on. And you're marched out the door, marched over to Babylon, and you suddenly realize your whole world's come to an end. So it's sort of understandable in a way how when Judah was taken captive that they couldn't take much with them, which is why they have 24 books today. And also, it's also why perhaps they relied on the word, because they had to do it from memory. And that's why you have the tradition of the elders starting to develop, because whilst they're away, they didn't have anything written down. So they had to start writing it down from memory. So I think history is very important to understand what was happening around those times.
Those type of things that you just mentioned, they're kept quiet, that it was rewritten from memory. And you, the only answer you hear is it's infallible. The word is written, and what you have is infallible. Don't question it. That's what we've had all of our life. So
yeah, and I was talking more about the tradition of the elders that is supplemented to the Old Testament or the Tanakh. But yes, you're absolutely right. And this is why 2 Esdras is a very important book for us. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. That's why Esdras is very important, because you know, if you read the book of 1 Esdras, it tells you about how the temple was rebuilt, and then it tells you that after they rebuilt it, Esdras complained to God that the law had all been burnt. They had no books because they didn't have any. They're all destroyed in the conquests.
Such an important point, Malcolm. This is such an important point. You know, and of course, these books appear in the Sefer as 3 Ezra and 4 Ezra. But yeah, 1st Esdras or 3 Ezra, it not only gives you the completion of the Second Temple, it lays out the timing, it gives you everything that you need to know, and Ezra's complaint in 4 Esdras, in my opinion, an entirely inspired work that is quoted from by the Mashiach in the Gospels when he talks about how I long to gather you as chicks under my wings. That's a direct quote from Enoch. The Olivet sermon from Matthew 24 is a direct quote from 4th Ezra 15. And so here we're going to see that. So to try to say that 4th Ezra or 2nd Esdras is uninspired and has no part of the canon is such a huge disservice to the public. And they're going to miss this most critical point that you're about to make here. And when you and I talked about this at the conference at Lutterworth, I was completely blown away, because we're going to see here that this point, I mean, I remember we had this incorrect because we were using some of the terminology from the old KJV version of 4th Esdras. We had the number incorrect. You wrote me about it. We did some research on it. We made the correction in the Millennium Edition. And this correction becomes absolutely critical, because this passage now looms large. So tell us about what's happening here.
Yeah, this is the most important piece, because if you're a Protestant and you don't read these books, you have your lamp half full. You don't have oil in your lamp to fight the fights at the end of time. You really need this information. And this really, I can't stress it, is the most important key to understanding. Because once you then embrace that there were 94 books before Mashiach, or when Mashiach was around, then it all starts to make sense. Why were these books rejected? Why were they hidden? You know, where are the Dead Sea Scrolls? How do they fit in? It all starts to make sense. So if we just read from 2 Esdras 14:20 onwards, Esdras complained to God that the law had been burnt, and it tells the story of how Esdras rewrote the Hebrew scriptures with the aid of 5 scribes, and in 40 days they rewrote 94 books. Now, there are a number of corruptions here that have crept in, and I'll explain that in a minute, but it's absolutely certain it's 94 books, and God told him to publish the first 24 openly for the worthy and unworthy, but to keep the 70 last for the wise amongst the people. And that's where we got our Old Testament from, because the Jewish Tanakh has got 24 books, and that's exactly the same as our Old Testament of 39. So when you see a reference here now to 24 OT 39, it's 24 if you're Jewish, or 39 if you're with Rome. But we also have evidence that the 70 were held exclusively in the Second Temple prior to its destruction in 70 AD. So if we can go to the next slide now, you can now see this is a quote. You know, the first 24 books were published for the worthy and the unworthy. And then at verse 46, to quote the Most High, but keep the 70 last, that thou mayst deliver them only to such as be wise amongst the people, for in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge, and I did so. Now those are truly amazing words, and most Bibles stop right there, and I did so. And that is actually the end of verse 47 in most people's Bibles today. They don't have those extra 2.5 verses which are on the end. And I think we need to recognize that anyone that says these books are not inspired, they need to think about that very carefully, because one day they might be standing at the throne and they may have to answer for that and actually say, well, they're not inspired, you know, I don't agree with you, sir, sorry. I wouldn't want to be that person, frankly. So I think we need to all wake up and start listening to this. It's very important for our time in the world today. Next slide. This is one of the old books that literally just flew into my hands when I was doing a search. It's a commentary on the Old Testament Apocrypha from Esdras to Maccabees in 1889, and it's published by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. Society that doesn't exist today, unfortunately, but they did produce a lot of very interesting work. And you have to ask yourself, they must have known something to produce this for mankind, but it never got really out into the open. But if you go within that book, next slide, you can see at verse 44, it says, in 40 days they wrote 204 books. And then in the margin, it says, or 904. And then if you read down the page, because this book comes with footnotes, and I found the footnotes to be almost as valuable as the text itself, because the footnotes give you history into what the compilers thought. And I'll just pull up another version of this so I can read it myself, because I can't quite see this at the moment. You just bear with me a minute. Yeah, so verse 44, it says 204 books. The manuscripts of the Latin version have here 904, as in the margin, but the other versions have preserved the true reading of 94, and that's the bit underlined in red. See also the next note. And then at verse 45, it says, the first that thou hast written publish openly, and compare that to verses 26 and verse 6. So if we go to the Et Sefer now and look at chapter 14, verse 26, it actually says, and when you have done some things that shall you publish, and some things shall you show secretly to the wise. So again, there's a reference there to two sets of books, a set for everybody, the public books, and a set for the wise, which are to be kept hidden. And if we go back to verse 6 of chapter 14, it tells you the story of Yah is talking to Ezra, how he met Moses in the bush. And I'll read from verse 4. And I sent him and led my people out of Mitzrayim and brought him up to the mount of where I held him by me a long season, and told him many wondrous things, and showed him the secrets of the times and the end, and commanded him, saying, verse 6, these words shall you declare, and these shall you hide. So we can see right there, Moses was given books to declare and books to hide. Now, what do we think they were? Because in verse 6, it tells you he'd given this all to Moses. And at verse 26, he was telling what he was going to do with these scribes. And then if you go right to the very end at verse 44, it tells you that 24 were published for the worthy and the unworthy, and 70 were published to be kept secret for the wise amongst the people. So that is a crucial piece of information that totally justifies these extra books and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we need to recognize that.
Wonderful.
And if I can just read a little bit more from that footnote there, because you don't find this sort of information readily on the internet even today, because it's so old. But it goes on to say, the Syriac and Arabic translations read, those 24 books which thou hast first written publish, and this appears to have been the reading of the original. The 24 books open to all to read are the books of the Old Testament. And when these are added to the 70 secret or apocryphal books, verse 36, there is made up the full number of the 94 books spoken of in the previous verse. The tradition of these hidden books seems to have been somewhat widely spread. Epiphanius, for instance, Bishop of Salamis in Cyprus, who died at an advanced age in 403 AD, in his marvelous narration of the manner in which was made the Greek translation, LXX, of the Old Testament, speaks of the 22 canonical and 72 apocryphal books. And that's in his book called Epiphanius Weights and Measures, which we're going to look at in a minute. And the Hebrew alphabet at that time had 22 letters, and the Greek alphabet had 24. And the number of the canonical books was made 24 by reckoning Ruth and the Lamentations of Jeremiah as separate books.
Boom.
And this is because originally there were 22 letters and 22 books, but we have to remember that there was a Greek rulership that took over the whole region, and they forced them to relinquish their religion, and there was such an uproar over it that the Greeks said, okay, you can keep your religion, but you've got to have Greek kings and Greek priests. And this is why you have various names in history like Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. I mean, they're Greek. They're Greek names. It's a bit like Prince Philip, God bless him. He was Greek. He came over here. He's Mountbatten with a German name, or Battenberg, but you can't get away from the fact he was Greek. So it begs the question: who were these kings and priests? They may have been local people or Jews that took on those names, like Josephus did, because Josephus, as we know, became Flavius Josephus, didn't he? He took on a Roman name to keep in with his masters. So that may have happened as well. But it clearly highlights how we have to be very careful with what's happened and be well aware of the history.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point, Malcolm. And a lot of these, in a lot of these cases, you did have the Greek names were indications of not necessarily a Greek status, but of some status other than a Hebrew status. And like a John Hyrcanus, for instance, would be a typical example of that. Or even the Maccabean is another typical example, that you had names that were distinct from the Hebrew names that were, that were writing through at that time. But, so much of what you've covered here is extremely important. This writing of Epiphanius, for instance, and talking about these number of books and how this is delineated. And also, can you talk, before we leave this slide, a little bit about the Henry VIII mistranslation?
Yes.
You mentioned something about the Henry VIII. So Henry VIII did not create a text with 204 books, but rather in the initial 1539 Great Bible of Miles Coverdale, the number was 204 at this point, correct?
No, I think it's referring to it's what occurred in Esdras 2 Esdras 14, and this is how the error crept in, because the footnote clearly says they mean 94 books, but in the actual verse at the top of the page, verse 44, it says 204. And then in the margin, it says 904, but it clarifies it in the notes and says, no, it actually meant 94. And if you go to the Common English Bible or the Revised Standard Version, both of those have the correct reading in verse 44, which says 94 books. And both of them say, keep 24 for the public and keep 70 hidden. So those two versions differ from all the other versions of the Bibles, because there's many versions out there. And I'm really trying to analyze where this corruption came from of 204 books. Because if the original reading was 94 in Latin, that was nonaginta quattuor, 94.
Yeah, a copy of the Coverdale here.
Right. And if you go then to the Latin Vulgate was the first one that introduced the corruption of the 904. Scripti sunt altern in quadraginca dribus libri non genti quattuor. And you can see non genti is very similar to nonaginca. You only need a couple of letters to change. And if some scribe was writing in the dark with a couple of candles and he was falling asleep, you could see how very easily that could have been mistranslated from 94 into 904. But then you come to the Great Bible of Henry VIII, 1539, which was related to Miles Coverdale, and that suddenly says Ducenti quattuor. Now, no other books have that. So where did they get the 204 from? But all they're doing is saying in verse 44 that they had these number of books out there. But the reading we believe is correct, and what these theologians are saying is correct, is no, it was 94. And I think we have to agree with that, because in those versions that we have, the CB and RSV, it clearly says the first 24 publish openly, but they keep the 70 last. And only that makes 94, doesn't it? 24 and 70 makes 94. So you don't suddenly get 904 or 204.
Right. Now I'm taking a look at, I'm looking at the Coverdale and it's very interesting because in the 1539 Coverdale, he delineates Ezra as fourth Ezra. It's 4 Ezra is his numbering, right? Not 2 Esdras, but fourth Esdras. And he says, and I'm going to try to read this because, of course, reading the ancient English is very difficult. So I took the 5 men to be commanded me, and we went into the field, and we remained there. The next day, a voice called me, Fayet, I guess, Esdras, open thy mouth, and I'm going to give you, and I opened my mouth, and behold, he readeth me a full cup, which was, of course, the cool, and then he ended up writing these books, right? And so he says, let me see if I can get to this. And it happened that they were fulfilled, that we were left, boy, I'll tell you, I can't read this ancient English.
You're doing well.
But let's see, thou mayest and entirely reflect on it among the people, for in them is the
spring of understanding.
Yeah, the what?
The spring of understanding.
Yeah, the spring of understanding. The fountain. Okay, so let's see if we can find this number in here.
It should be at verse 44, just before that.
Yeah, let me see if it said that there were. Oh, yeah, it says 204 books. It says, right. But in the night, they are restless for me. And anyway, held not my tongue by night. Yes. And in Baez, they wrote 204 books. So here in the Coverdale, we see 204 is the number.
And what year was that?
1539. Yeah.
So that's where the great Bible of Henry VIII clearly got that information from. But it's the only reference to the 204. And in the footnotes here, it explains that away as to how they came to that. And it's also confirmed by Epiphanius in his record as well. So I think we can be totally sure it means 94. There's 24 and 17.
Your argument here is very persuasive. And we see this actually very common, Malcolm, in the ancient world, like when you talk about this non-genti quator, right? As compared to non-aginta quator,
yes.
Right? That this is, you would see this very commonly in the Hebrew, you see this quite often, where they mistake a yod for a vav or a vav for a yod, and they get a different word. And just with a slight discrepancy like this, and possibly amongst non-understanding, and you know, if you don't read a language well, where do you get the most confused? It's with numbers, right? It's with, and particularly like in Hebrew, when you deal with numbers, the numbers are almost impossible. When you talk about, for instance, 70 versus 7, like to give you an example, you have this passage in Daniel 9:24, right? And the passage reads Shabbat, Shabbat. Now, people, and that's translated as 70 weeks. Well, how did you get that? Well, we took that as the plural of 7, right? Well, is the plural of 7 70, or is the plural of 77 49? You know, what are you talking about? Are you talking about 7 sevens, which is 49, or are you talking about 77s? So as soon as you're dealing with numbers, you're getting into something that if you're not a native speaker, you're going to have trouble pulling through the Latin. And if Coverdale was pulling this out of the Latin in part, if he was using the Codex Vaticanus, you can see how this would have been an easy mistake to have made.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so that's a bit of information about the history of the Old Testament, if you like, or the Bible, as to how that was put together. If we go to the next slide now, and that's why this is very important for us to understand what the Septuagint is, because if you go on the internet and do a search for Septuagint, you'll come up with this. It's the earliest extant Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, completed in the mid-3rd century BC, with the remaining texts completed later on in the 2nd century BC. And then you got the reference to the letter of Aristeas, who tells you how Philadelphus, persuaded by his librarian, wanted to get a copy, and how they made the translation, but it doesn't really give you any detailed information. And there's also some references to Clement of Alexandria and the Alexandrian Library and Eusebius. And then you've got Epiphanius, who gives us the most detailed account ever of how the scriptures were put together. So that's what we're now going to look at. We're now going to study Eusebius to see what we can find out there. Next slide. So once you start to delve into this, you very soon become aware of contradictions. Greek audience, from Hebrew to Greek, why would you call it Septuagint? Surely they wouldn't understand that. It would have to be called Evdeminta, which is 70 in Greek. So, and then why would you call it 70 if it didn't contain 70 books? Because we're told it contains the Old Testament of 24 or 39, and then you add in the Apocrypha, the 14 books. Well, that doesn't add up to 70 either. Then you've got these translators, and we know there were 72. So why would you call something 70 when it was 72? It should have been Septuagint Jew. So, and then why translate it in two parts, which is what we're told? Because if you were the librarian waiting for these books, you'd be dead as a dodo before they arrived. So it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, really great points, Malcolm. I mean, this is why in dealing with Greek scholars who are very, Septuagint reliant, right? They didn't want to answer this question. Why is it only Septuagint and not Septuagint do, right? Why do we not have the 72 being discussed there? What's going on here? Something is amiss in the name.
And then you start to see, you look at the history of the Alexandrian library, and then you find out that it was ransacked 3 times. And that's when the penny starts to drop. Because then you realize that something's gone on here to cover this up, to hide it from mankind, so that you don't find the truth, you don't find the way. And that's really what this quest is all about, is to get to the truth of it. So if we go to the next slide now. So we know the story with Esdras and what he said. He said there were 94 books. So now we're going to go and see what the record of Epiphanius says. And I'd have to say that most theologians reject Epiphanius. They say he's muddled. He couldn't, all his writings are muddled up. But this is a guy who was in his 80s, and he spoke 5 languages, and he lived in a time where you had to be very careful. And this is why you find his writings are squirreled away in all sorts of different chapters, all muddled up. It's because if it was a very neat story about how the translation was made, they probably would have found it and strung him up or done something to him like that. So he had to hide this information away, because don't forget, in the 10th century, if you had books that weren't approved by Rome, you didn't survive very long. So if you start to go, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, Malcolm, that, now he was 4th century, right? Epiphanius, 4th century.
Yes. Yeah. He died, I think it's 404 or something like that. But yes, mostly.
So this is because, the canon was not discussed at all in the Roman Church until the first evidence we have at all of any canon, any, enclosure of books with the exclusion of others. It comes from this thing called the Moratorian Fragment. And the Moratorian Fragment was allegedly constructed in the 4th century and presented to, the 5th century, and presented to Pope Damasus around 428 AD. So we're talking after the death of Epiphanius, this Moratorian Fragment arrives, and the Moratorian Fragment essentially says, this is what they're using in Alexandria for a New Testament, 27 books. Therefore, and this is the real criteria for the quote unquote inspired word of God. Well, this is what they used in Alexandria. Therefore, that's what you should use, right? And so this is the very first time that we see any record at all of 27 books in the NT comes from this Moratorian Fragment. And it's interesting that it would follow the death of Epiphanius, right?
Yeah. And we'll go into it a bit more, and you'll see what we found. But basically, the book of Epiphanius of Salamis, Weights and Measures, you can get that. It's from Cambridge University Library. It's also in the Chicago University, I think, as well. They have a version of it as well. But I put the reference numbers. So each of those bullet points, you see at the end there, it says 985. Well, that's where that particular reference has come from. And you do have to read the whole document, because, as I say, the information is all over the place, because he didn't want anyone to find it, basically. Case he got in trouble. So the first point was that the translation was made in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and it was in the 7th year of his reign. So we now know it was done in 276. And as I say, all this information from Epiphanius is not mainstream. They don't want to know. They don't want to really consider this. So you get all these sorts of vague numbers. Oh, it was translated in 250 BC or whatever. Yeah, but we now have an actual year. And he was collecting books worldwide for his library. And Ptolemy wrote to the rulers in Jerusalem, and the books were duly sent in gold Hebrew letters. And of course, Ptolemy couldn't speak Hebrew, so he had to write a second letter, and he asked them to be translated into Greek. And then they dispatched the 72 scribes to translate the 22 Hebrew books and the 72 apocryphal, or apocrypha. Next slide. Yeah. So here's a brief summary of his work. It describes the translation on the Pharian island of Anoge. Now that is in the mouth or the delta of the River Nile, because there were lots of islands there, and on one of them there was a monastery called on the Pharian Isle of Anoge. So that's where the translation actually took place. And he's the only one that also tells us how they were segregated, because they were segregated into cubicles, and there were 2 scribes and a helper that looked after their food and water and stuff like that. And it tells you how the books were arranged into the 22 canonical, the 2 poetic, which is the Esdras and Lamentations that the book of Esdras tells us that were moved across, and then the 70 apocryphal books. And that
now, can you stop for a second, just a second, Malcolm, because I want to crack this nut a little bit. You wrote me something very specific on this that I thought was really incredible. So the 2 poetic books were Ruth and Lamentations. Yes. Okay, and then the 22 books were aligned as what? 4 Pentateuchs and 2 additional books, correct?
Yes, correct. Yes, and my understanding is, and it's what Epiphanius says in that commentary book, was that originally they had 22 books in the, we'll call it the Hebrew Tanakh, if you like, because there were 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. That's what Epiphanius says. And then during the Greek rule period, 2 more books were added to make it 24. Now, whether that's true or not, who knows?
Well, that's very, very likely. I mean, let's just take 1 second to talk about this for a second. You have the idea of Psalm 119, which is it is 22 groups of verses in 7 verses per group, right? And those 22 verses are delineated by the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There is Psalm 34, which is delineated by the Hebrew alphabet. Each verse begins with Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, He, etc. Psalm 145 does the same thing, although the noon is missing in that extrapolation. When you look at the book of Lamentations, the book of Lamentations is very, very interesting, because Lamentations, although it has 5 chapters, the 3rd chapter is 66 verses. So the first chapter is 22, the second chapter is 22. Then you have a 3rd chapter that's 66 verses. And then you have, so that takes you up to 5. And then there's 2 remaining chapters that are both 22 verses each. So if you delineate the 5th chapter, the 3rd chapter, and you break it into groups, in the Sefer, if you look at your Sefer, you will see that we have Lamentations numbered as Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. When you get to chapter 2, Aleph, Aleph, Beit, Beit, Gimel, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet. And this is actually what appears in the original Hebrew. So this is absolutely no shock to me whatsoever that the Tanakh would have 22 books in it. It's just absolute. This number 22 in the Hebrew world was so exceedingly important to Solomon that Ecclesiastes would be written this way. It was so important to David that you would have Psalm 34, 145, and 119 delineated this way. And when you read in the book of Yovelim, there is Jubilees, there is specific discussion about the 22 kinds of species that existed on earth prior to the flood, the 22 kinds of work that existed on earth, and the fact that there were 22 patriarchs from Adam to Yaakov.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what Epiphanius also gives us, he actually names the 72 translators. He actually has you have their names written in this document, and it was taken from the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's 2 translators from each tribe, and it tells you how the king collected books from all over the world, and it also gives you the exact copies of the 2 letters that were written. And you have to ask yourself, where did Epiphanius get this information from? How did he have the exact copies of the 2 letters that were written? And it gives you the exact timings of all the events. So I don't see why this book should be squirreled away and hidden. I think this book should be put on the top of the mantelpiece for everyone to read, because it gives us the truth about the history of how it was put together.
Do you have a true copy of the Epiphanius? Do you have a true copy of it? I
only have the online copies. Yeah.
But you do have an online copy of Epiphanius.
You can get it from Cambridge University, or there's a Chicago University version as well. But you can just search online, you find it. Very easy to get hold of.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide. Now this is where the research and the investigator starts to play a part, because we're told that the original concept was by Ptolemy Soter, and he lived from 323 down to 283, because we're counting down because it's the BC period. But the actual library was set up by his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, or Philadelphus II. And he was born in 309, and he co-reigned with his father for 2 years. So from 285 to 283, he co-reigned with his father, and then he died in 246. And the record tells us that the librarian was somebody called Demetrius Phaleron. And then you look at that and you think, oh, hang on a minute. Demetrius Phaleron, he died in 283, the same year as Ptolemy Soter died. And you read a bit further and you discover that he died of a snake bite in the Upper Nile. So he couldn't have been the librarian. And then it starts to get a bit obscure, because you think, well, who was the librarian then? And we're told that they collected books from all over the world. When a ship arrived, they went on board, they took the books off the ship, brought them back to the office or whatever it was, copied them and gave them back. And they obviously got to hear about the 70 hidden books, because the 24 public books would have been everywhere. Because if you say, no, they weren't, then you have to agree that there were no books at all. And the Jews living in Jerusalem didn't have anything. And they must have had something. So they obviously had the 24 books, which were widely known, because if you're in Alexandria, it's not that far away to Jerusalem, you know, a boat ride or a camel ride. And I'm quite certain the 24 books were available even in Alexandria, but they got to hear about the 70 hidden books, which were exclusively in the Second Temple. And we know that from the Esdras account that they were. So that's an interesting bit of history. We then, coming back to this library issue, the library was part destroyed by Rome. They took all the books into the courtyard and burnt some of them. And then it was fully destroyed in 270 to 275 AD. And that's when Christianity was on the rise, if you like, after the period when all the early followers had been killed and in the Colosseum and places like that. And then we also read about the Serapeum, which was a daughter library, annex library, that was also demolished. So the Romans came back 3 times to destroy these libraries. And if you were the librarian and they came along and burnt a few books, well, you'd think, hang on a minute, we better hide these because they're very precious to us. So they obviously squirreled them away somewhere and probably sent them up to the Serapeum. But of course, then the Romans came back and got those as well. And it's then we find out that Demetrius Phaleron had a grandson by the same name. And then it all starts to make sense. And he died in Cyprus. And here's where the calculation comes in, because we know that the grandfather, Demetrius Phaleron, he was born in 350 BC, and we were told that he was 67 when he died. So we can imagine if he was 22 years old and he had his son, and then the son had his son when he was 22, that was the grandson. So we can assume from that that the grandson was probably born around 306 BC, which would have meant in the time of the translation, which was 276 or down to 278 period, around that period, the librarian would have been between 30 and 56 years old. So it's very clear to me that Demetrius Phaleron, the grandson, was the true librarian of the Alexandrian library.
But now, Malcolm, let's reflect for a minute about these 3 burnings by Rome. What a crime against humanity that was.
Absolutely.
You know, to destroy all the knowledge base of the known world at that time simply because they're Rome. It's just outrageous, an outrageous crime.
Well, I think there's more to that story as well, because obviously they destroyed it, but where did they take the information? The information that they wanted, they took to Constantinople, because that was the seat of the Roman Empire with Constantine and Eusebius. So Eusebius and Constantine were there, which is where they formulated their version of what the truth ought to be. But then when Constantine died, he had two sons. And the one that was living in Rome, he said, well, my kids are going to school. They've got no books. You've got all the books. We want some of them. And his brother wouldn't give him any of the books. So he ended up going to war, and he ransacked the library in Constantinople. And that's when the books were all brought back to Rome and the Vatican. And that's the Vatican was formed after that. So you can see the trail of information. It's a bit like follow the money. Where's the money gone? In this case, we're following the information. So you're going from Alexandria to Constantinople back to Rome. And I'm quite certain that all of these books are in a library somewhere in the southern part of Italy or the middle of Italy. But
yeah, it's very possible.
We don't know.
It's possible that the Vatican has been sequestered somewhere.
Mm.
And of course,
They
questions.
probably don't even know themselves. It's so many years have passed by, they probably don't even know what they've got.
Yeah, agreed.
Anyway, next slide. So we know the Hebrew scriptures were translated to Greek. We now know exactly when it happened. And I think the interesting thing with Epiphanius is he was acutely aware the Alexandrian library was destroyed by Rome 3 times. And then also, he was living in the AD period, so he would have also known about the Second Temple, and that library was destroyed as well. And he knew about Demetrius Phaleron, the grandson, because he died in Cyprus. Now, if Epiphany was the bishop of Constantina in Cyprus, which is today, that's Famagusta, which is in the Turkish part on the eastern side of Cyprus. So if Epiphanius was the bishop, the public records would have been held in that monastery or church, whatever it was, in Cyprus. So I'm quite certain that Epiphanius got the record that was left to him or his predecessors by Demetrius Phaleron, because where else would he have got the copies of those 2 letters, exact copies of the letters and exact copies of all the names of the translators, the exact information in detail? Where would he have got that information from other than the librarian? And the librarian went to Cyprus and died there. So I think we have a conclusive proof that the Epiphanius record is totally reliable. It totally supports Esdras, and we need to start embracing this.
Yeah, very persuasive argument, very persuasive, Malcolm. And I think that there is a strong link there because, of course, we see, again, plenty of historic reference to texts being retained. I mean, I'd like to give you an example. The historical record on the book of Jasher in the Hebrew text was sequestered from the Second Temple library just prior to the temple being burned in 68 AD. And there was a scribe who had that text, and he said, we can't let this text burn. And he fled with the help of a Roman centurion. And they went out to, the former site of Carthage and ultimately ended up in Spain with the Hebrew version of Yashar or Jasher, the book of Jasher, where it was retained, sequestered in its Hebrew form for roughly 1,400 years before somebody finally decided to publish it in the Hebrew. And it was published in the Hebrew for the first time in the mid 1400s and denounced because, of course, they published the Zohar at the same time they published Jasher. And the Zohar, of course, is, Kabbalistic in nature. And Jasher sat on the shelf. It had been denounced. It was, that's like Zohar. Well, it wasn't. It had to be a Hebrew scholar to understand it. And then finally, there was a Hebrew scholar who did understand it in the 19th century, living in London. And he went through and translated it. And when he did, as soon as anyone found out that there was a guy translating the Hebrew text of Jasher, somebody quickly rushed to a publisher and published pseudo Jasher, a complete forgery made up, claiming that this is the book of Jasher. They ended up going to prison for it. So this fellow who translated the book of Jasher, he couldn't publish it in Britain. So he took the work, all of his work, his lifetime work, and he took it to New York, and it was ultimately published in 1887 in New York for the first time we get an English translation of this book of Jasher that had been sequestered from this exact problem. And now we see, so when you talk about this link up between the Alexandrian library, Demetrius Phaleron, who ends up in the island of Cyprus. This is historical record that he died in Cyprus, correct?
Yes, so, absolutely.
So if you've got a historical record, and of course this makes sense too, that Cyprus has always been a bit of a haven, if you will, a safe haven, right? You have to get there by boat. That always helps. And he had left Alexandria to get away from the Roman persecution. I know nothing. Where's the librarian? I don't know. He's gone. We don't know where he is, right?
Yeah.
He had taken off, and he took off with whatever he could stuff into his briefcase, if you will. And he couldn't take the 70 with him, but he could take the letters. Now, maybe he took the 70 with him. Maybe he did. But what's interesting to me, and I want to reflect on this before we go to the next slide, when we talk about Septuagint, I think that what was being stated there was that they were talking about the 70 sequestered books, and the expectation was that there was going to be a Greek translation of the 70 sequestered books, and it was never forthcoming.
Yes.
It was retained in the ancient Hebrew, never forthcoming in the Greek.
No, I think they had them in the Greek, but obviously Rome took them up to Constantinople, and maybe some of them didn't find their way to the Vatican, possibly. But yeah, I mean, we're certainly told by Epiphanius that the translation took place, and they did translate 94 books. I think we can be certain they were translated.
Okay,
maybe they didn't find their way there. But if there's anyone wants to go on an expedition, I would love to go to Famagusta in Cyprus, because I think you'll find in the tomb there and the chapels there, I think you'll find a lot of information there that's relevant to this. And I think it's very interesting how the word is preserved in places like Famagusta, which is in the Turkish part, because it's out of the realms of Christendom, if you like. And it's a bit like the Ethiopian text, because of course we know about the Inquisitions that went around Europe and killing anyone and anything that moved that didn't comply with the Roman edicts. So Ethiopia was forgotten because they never went there. And so you have these little places in history where the word has been preserved. And I think Famagusta is one, because I think the truth is there still. And I'd say I'd love to explore and do some archaeological work around there, because I'm sure you'd find something.
You've said it, and therefore we must do it. You've said it, therefore we must do it. Now, of course, right now it's a troubled world, because the Turks are raising their claim over Cyprus again.
Absolutely.
Hold on a second. Somebody asked if there's a Hebrew copy of Jasher. We have a free download of that on the Sefer website, and if we can put that up for the site for Hebrew Jasher, and then you can get your own copy. But when you're talking about that, I think you're right about this, that we should be in Cyprus and we should be doing and taking a look at that particular. That's one library that would be fantastically interesting. There's another library that I wrote to you about, which is there is a group of people called the Yitzhers, or I don't remember the name now. It's a very obscure sect. They have a single monastery, if you will, in eastern Iraq. It's near the Syrian. The Yazidis. It's the Yazidis. And these Yazidis are alleged to have a bunch of first century texts, including, it's rumored, first century gospels in Hebrew.
Yes. I'm sure we're going to find these things coming out. Hagia Sophia is another one as well.
What's that?
Hagia Sophia, that's in Istanbul, which is Constantinople. But of course, we have to remember that you had the division with Constantine's two sons between the Eastern Orthodox and what became the Roman Church. And Epiphanius was actually Orthodox. He was Orthodox in his belief. And just to finish this off about him, the reason he wrote this book was to preserve the truth, because he wrote this book in 392. Now, that was a year after the library. Sorry, that's three. Yes, it was. It was a year after the Romans destroyed the Alexandria for the last time. And he was probably outraged that all this information was being burnt, just like we are. You know, we're outraged that, you know, people go to such lengths to destroy valuable information like that. So that's why he wrote his book, and I believe he wrote his book to preserve that truth for a time like today. So I think that's worth pointing out.
Yeah, yeah, it's just fantastic information, fantastic information. So we will have to, I'm going to put this in the planning stages, Malcolm, for a trip to Cyprus. And we can go to, you know, we can go to Lanarka or whatever. We'll land on the Greek side and then see what we can do. Remember that there is a, you know, there's a brewing war between Greece and Turkey right now, and it is a claim to Cyprus. And to make that transfer through Nicosia into the Turkish side, I do have some friends living on the Turkish side, however, that could get us access. Now, maybe we don't fly into the Greek side, Limassol or Lanarka, but instead we go into the Nicosian side, and then and make the research from there. And
I think it's definitely worth pursuing. Definitely. Okay, well, there's only a couple more slides just to wrap this up, really. We're almost out of time, I think. Are we, Jessica?
You got about half an hour, so you're okay. You'll get through your slides.
Okay, so yeah, to go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so that one, really, you can see now that Judaism adopted the 24 public books, and then they added their tradition of the elders. And as we said, you know, they didn't have much when they were in Babylon, so they had to write it down from memory. So that's where perhaps that's come from. And then we know about the Masoretic text, and this sort of explains why their patriarch is perhaps Moses, because if we read in Jude, obviously it tells you how, you know, he was saying go back to the faith once delivered unto the saints, because they were obviously going off in one direction, which must have been different to the direction he was going in. And then we talk about, sorry, carry on.
No, that's a very interesting point, because again, you know, there's a passage in the Gospels where you have the scribes talking to Mashiach, and they say, you know, well, Moses gave us a certificate of divorce. And Mashiach says something very, very succinct to him, very important. He says, well, I tell you the truth, Moses suffered to give you a certificate of divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. But I tell you the truth, that in the beginning, it was not so. So you have the Messiah saying Moshe stepped on the pre-existing Torah, stepped on the paradise Torah. He stepped on it. And it's an extremely important point. And Ezekiel would reiterate that. So when you see this, you know, it's very important, I think, for the world to understand. Moshe was not a sinless man. He was not a, you know, unblemished offering. He was a sinful man. He, like David, was a murderer. Right. And he was also rebellious. He argued with Yah when Yah told him, I want you to go speak to Pharaoh. I can't talk. Get my brother to do it. Right. And he disobeyed when Yah told him, speak to the rock, that water would come out of it. And he struck it twice to demonstrate Moses's authority, not the authority of the word of Yah. Just as when he was told to put a seraph on a banner and he put a brass serpent on a pole. He put the brass serpent on the pole to show his authority, not the authority of Yah. And so this is why this is why Jude, if you recall, quotes directly from the book of Hanok.
Absolutely. And many other books as well, actually.
Yeah.
I can show you some other quotations in there, which word for word almost, but most people don't realize, you know, the focus is on Enoch because he actually names Enoch. And I think it's very interesting because he names Enoch the seventh from Adam, because of course we know there was another Enoch, the son of Cain. So he's making an absolute distinction between the righteous path and the non-righteous path. And that's very important because there are books of Enoch which are Masonic in nature and have all sorts of other stuff in there. So we need to be absolutely certain, because a lot of people say, oh, you mustn't read Enoch because of that, when actually, no, you just got to make sure you get the right Enoch books as well. So I think that's a very good point. But I was reading the other day, I can't remember what book it was, but it was actually saying that Moses wandered in the desert for 49 years, and it was to cleanse them, which would make sense because it was a week of years, which is obviously a jubilee, and that's why he didn't make it. So that I'll see if I can find that reference for you as well. But that was just something that came to me the other day.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Jubilees chapter 50. Jubilees chapter 50 talks about
Is
that.
it Jubilee? Does it?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Maybe where I read it then. Yes. Yeah. So just to summarize this, so Rome erroneously adopted the Jewish Old Testament books, and they made them 39 because they counted 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel differently. It's the same, exactly the same books, but it's just numbered differently. So that's why I call it the 24 OT 39. We know that the Apocrypha were added later, including 2 Esdras. And just to come back to your other point, 2 Esdras 14 verse 6 clearly says that God spoke to Moses and gave him words openly and gave him words hidden. So for our Jewish friends, that should be a very good answer, that that's why these books are for them too. It's not just the 24. And I think that's where people are starting to realize and wake up to the truth, because these 2 sticks do have to become one. And Judah is still the tribe, one of the tribes of Israel. And whatever history and all this nonsense going on in the world today, we have to remember that these people are part of Yasharel, and they will come together with us in the end of days. I think that's a very important point to remember. Yeah. So that really sort of summarizes what I've discovered in relation to the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the next part is equally enthralling, hopefully, because it will tell you further information related to that, which I've discovered. And I think, with time, etc., we need to perhaps call it a day on that. There is one more slide. Is it? Yes, about the. There's 2 more actually. Yeah, so here in terminology, I think we need to also remember terminology, because people talk about the Hebrew scriptures when they mean the Old Testament, when there are many other books written in Hebrew. So we need to remember that, yes, the Hebrew scriptures are more than just what we've traditionally known. And what we're really talking about, we're on the same page here, we're really talking about restoration of the full set of Hebrew scriptures, all the 94. And that really is where we're heading and the quest of the day. And I honestly do think these are the books that Daniel was told to hide till the end days, and are coming back for a reason, because we need the information contained with them. And with these books, we will have our lamps entirely full of oil in order to deal with the things that are going to be coming our way in the future. So I think this is all for a reason.
When you speak about that, Malcolm, I mean, I can tell you, we have uncovered a number of texts and have published them. For instance, I'll give you an example. We don't publish them inside the covers of the Sefer, but we publish them in books. For instance, we have a book called Breshith, and Breshith has the testimony of Moshe. It has the apocalypse of Abraham. It has the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. These things are published in here. Now, of course, there's the 2 books of Adam and Eve too, but these appear to be pseudepigraphal works. However, some of these other earlier works are not pseudepigraphal. We're currently preparing a very limited offer through Sefer Publishing Group concerning, if you pick up a Sefer in this upcoming month, of the first 150 people that come through, they will get a copy of the book Joseph and Asenath, Joseph and Asenath. Now, when I did the reading on that, I did the editing on that particular book, and I'll tell you, I was absolutely blown away by what was in that book. Huge messianic prophecy in the middle of that, and
isn't that so inspiring? Such an inspiring book,
Oh, it's just inspiring. It's so beautiful, and I mean, there's a couple of previews on it. When Asenath hears about Joseph coming to visit, it's like, didn't that guy just spend 12 years in prison? I'm not interested in meeting some convicted rapist that you're going to bring into the house, right? This is her opinion. And then she sees him, and just one look immediately tells her that this guy is an extraordinarily righteous man, right? Just one look. And so she goes down to meet him, and he touches her.
Yes.
And as soon as he touches her, he says, it's not permissible for a son of Yasharel to have anything to do with the person who worships idols, just from one touch. And she's like, And then she goes up to her room and finds all those idols. Many of them had to be silver and gold, right? Had to be silver and gold idols. And she's like chucking them out the bedroom window. Out you go, right? It's such a fantastic story about how the two of them are reconciled. And of course, it also gives you additional information about the fact that after Ephraim and Manasseh, there were other children born. Now, this becomes an extremely, when we deal with British history, this becomes an extremely important point, because those other children of Joseph, in my opinion, become the tribe of Joseph, not the tribe of Manasseh, not the tribe of Ephraim, but the tribe of Joseph, a distinct tribe that would be speaking Egyptian, that came under the tutelage of Omri in the northern kingdom in the land of Canaan, who were cast into dispersion at the time of the Assyrians, and were known as the children of Omri, or from Omri, Qumri. Yes. And these children of Yosef, not from Ephraim, not from Manasseh, but actually from Joseph, speaking original Egyptian, ended up in Wales. Yes. And that this is the source of the Welsh language, and these are the Cymric people.
Well, the Welsh language is very similar to the Cornish language, and also what they spoke in Brittany as well. So there's definitely a linkage there. Absolutely, 100% agree with you.
Yeah. So this is
fascinating. It's fascinating because all these extra books, to me, they bring the scriptures alive, because it gives you so much more information, and it truly is inspiring. And anyone who says these are not inspired, they obviously haven't read them, because if they had read them, they would have woken up to the truth.
Yeah. Well, so, there was one fellow that came on, and he was, he took a look at the Sefer, and he said, Second Baruch, that's an uninspired work. I'm going to do a video denouncing Second Baruch. So he gets his video camera going, and he's reading Second Baruch, and pretty soon he's like, wow. And the next thing you know, he becomes a huge fan of the Sefer, and in particular of Second Baruch, because of the overwhelming beauty of the book.
So Stephen, very quickly, the books that are not included in the Sefer, why have you printed them? Obviously they have an authority, but just explain so the newbies here understand why you've made them as a separate book.
Well, they're part of the reason is, I can tell you, like, for instance, let me first deal with the book Havot. Okay, Havot is a book that deals with New Testament writings. That includes the Gospel of Nicodemus, the Gospel of Miriam, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Vision of Paul, the Ascension of James, which are taken from Clement's recognitions, the Martyrdom of Polycarp, the Epistle of Barnabas, the 5 Irenaeus epistles, 2 epistles of Clement. All of these are contained in the book Havot. And when I was praying about this book, I was thinking, well, I'll just put these together with the New Testament and we'll just call it this book. And Yah told me, don't you dare do that, because you will create idolatry if you do. Okay, so that's why these New Testament writings were not included with the New Testament. Now, when we talk about the Old Testament, the testimony of the 12 patriarchs is a phenomenal work. I do believe that the testimony of the 12 patriarchs in its current form does have some Roman overwrite in it. And this is something that Malcolm phrased here. I thought was a great phrase to understand: Roman overwrite. And this takes a real discerning eye to see the Roman overwrite. But I believe there's Roman overwrite in some of the epistles of Paul. There's Roman overwrite in the 12 testaments of the patriarchs. There's some Roman overwrite in there, and there may be some Essene overwrite in both Jubilees and in Enoch. There was some overwrite that took place there. And so, again, I don't want to shake anybody's faith, but, this problem of coming out of a church where somebody has got an NIV, which is a paraphrase of 2 of the worst, most corrupted codexes they could have ever used for a Bible. And this is it's not even a translation of it. It's a paraphrase of it. And the pastor's up there screaming at you, this is the inerrant word. This is the inerrant word. And so by the when you start with that premise, you've got no discernment whatsoever. So you can't read and understand what's going on. These are ancient scriptures. They're ancient books. And you have to have discernment. You have to be able to look and see and use your mind when you're reading these things.
Yes.
So we decided that some of these books, rather than us pass judgment on them, for instance, Malcolm has provided me with a list of what we believe to be the 70 books. Now, in that list is some very interesting works, right? There's some very interesting works in there. And when we look at those, we can say, yeah, I'm not prepared to lob those into a single cover until I've got more evidence concerning those books.
Okay.
I mean, we prayed long and hard concerning Second Baruch, with Hanok. You had 5 copies of Hanok in the Dead Sea Scrolls and 6 copies of Jubilees. There were more copies of Jubilees than there were of Moses' Torah in the caves of Qumran. So that tells me something right there. Now, you can say, well, the Romans didn't canonize it and blah, blah, blah. Well, the Essenes did, or whoever it was that was blogging these books at Qumran, they canonized it. This was their collection. That's what they had collected. And so, therefore, we said this was information not known to the general public because the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't discovered until the 20th century. So these were not known to the early English writers and so on and so forth. So we decided to move forward with them. Same thing with Acts 29, not known until the 1890s.
Yeah.
Right. And so these things, we believe these were needed corrections that had to be placed together under the single text. But when you're talking about the testimony of Moshe, the Apocrypha of Abraham, which, by the way, the Apocalypse of Abraham is an incredibly important book. It's an incredibly important book. And I'll tell you another book that's incredibly important, The Ascension of Isaiah. Now, Adam Fink over Parable of the Vineyard did a discussion on the Ascension of Isaiah, and he and I discussed it to some length. What an extremely important book that is, as is Third Baruch, an extremely important book. And according to the list you sent me, Malcolm, there appears to be a 4th and 5th Baruch, a 4th and 5th Baruch that existed in there. Now, this doesn't surprise me. Baruch was a scribe. And it's very possible that one of those texts, the 4th or 5th Baruch, could have been this, what we call the Epistle of Jeremiah, which was an additional chapter that we added to 1st Baruch, actually. But this could have been actually 5th Baruch. Now, here's something else, too. When you read the text of Scripture, you find out there's a bunch of books missing. Where's the book of Edo? Where's the book of Elijah? Where's the book of Nathan? Where's the book of War? I mean, all of these are discussed explicitly by name in the 66-book canon, and yet they're non-existent. Where are they? Where'd they go? Right? So you can see that that's one set. So when we look at the books, and say, in our opinion, these texts are extremely authentic. Like, I believe Joseph and Asenath is authentic. But there's a rabbi out there saying, oh, that's nonsense, blah, blah, pseudepigraphal written, blah, blah. Like everybody wants to say that Enoch was written in 300 BC. Oh, that's a recent text. It can't possibly be antediluvian. On the face, it claims to be an antediluvian text. But you want to claim that that was written in 300 BC. Based upon what? Why don't you show me the original of Isaiah? Why don't you show me the original text of Genesis? Why don't you show me the original book of 1 Kings? Why don't you show me that? You can't show me that. But for some historian to come and say, oh, that was clearly written in 300 BC. It might have been clearly copied in 300 BC or 400 BC, but the text itself lays a claim to be an authentic antediluvian text. And it's extremely important when you talk about it as an antediluvian text, because the mythology that is taught to us today is that fallen watchers came to the earth and had relationships with chimpanzees, and mankind was created as a slave class to these Elohim who were going to then mine gold for them. This is what the History Channel has portrayed for the last 20 years? Hanok is the one that says, no, there were 7 generations on earth before the Watchers came. 7 generations. They weren't here at the beginning. They were 7 generations later. Genesis 6:4 testifies to the fact that they were tempted by human women. That's what the temptation was. So Hanok becomes an extremely important book. And of course, all the naysayers, oh, you need to burn the Sefer because it publishes Hanok. Jude quoted from it. Well, Jude didn't know what he was doing. Well, isn't that nice of you? Now, all of a sudden, you're going to sit here and say, I've got my surgical knife out. I'm cutting out the book of Enoch. And while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the book of Jude too, right? Why not? I'm going to cut out the references in 2 Peter. I'm going to cut out the quotes out of the New Testament. Get out my scalpel and cut, because I don't want to believe there is any possibility that anybody was reading Hanok. Although Tertullian says they were, Origen says they were, Justin Martyr says they were. All of them argued that Enoch should have been considered part of the canon. But when you're talking about a Jewish tradition of saying we're going to put 22 books in because they need to reflect the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and that's all we're going to put in. is 22 books to reflect on the 22 letters of the Ivrit alphabet. I can understand their reasoning. I mean, you can see that this was why they would have a 22-book source text, because we want only these 22 letters from the Aleph Beit. This is what is going to be commonly known, the Aleph Beit. Aleph through Tav, right? That becomes very, very important the way this would be done. But does that the rabbis weren't reading anything else? That's wrong. The rabbis read everything else.
I think that's very interesting, because we're in a transition period, really, because we now have the tools to challenge how things were put together and the sources and where they came from as well. And, you know, some of these things just don't stack up. But, you know, we can't definitively say what is correct and what isn't. We're still in this sort of a transition phase, really, and many books are coming to light. And I firmly believe all the books will come to us at the end of days. I think that's all going to come out, and the whole truth will be known, because mankind has to know this, and you know that it can't be hidden away forever.
Yes.
Yeah, there's one more slide.
We've got 15 minutes, so please continue with the slides.
So, you know, if there's any lingering doubts from anyone, you know, the translation was made for Greek-speaking Jews. So the question is, why is Judaism then just looking at the 24? Because there were another 14 books were apparently translated for them, which they're not using. And then, you know, 1 Esdras, you know, how the Second Temple was rebuilt, very important book. And then, of course, how the scriptures were rewritten in 2 Esdras. So I would have thought, you know, everybody would want to read these, you know, because they are so inspiring as well. So I think, you know, just to summarize what we've done here is we're really saying that the Greek Septuagint, as we've been told, the contents aren't entirely correct. And it could be because when Rome took the books out from Alexandria, they only had a few of them left because some of them may have been burnt. We don't know. That's why they ended up with the 14. Or maybe when they got to Constantinople, one son took some of them and he took them to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the others went west to Rome. We'll never really know. But I do firmly believe this will come out in our age. We will see this coming in full, and we're going to be totally in the light once this happens. And I'm just feel so good that we are blessed with what we're seeing today. The Et Sefer is a fantastic document that's come out. Yes, there are other books that are kept apart, and I think that's a very valuable and the right thing to do till we're certain how these fit together, because we can then put them all together in their rightful place. So that's really all I've got to say on this. But I think part 2, we're going to go into this a bit more detail as well. So I hope you found this interesting. And it's what I came up with. And anyone could do the similar search on the internet and come up with the same conclusion as well. So it's all there if you just dig. But what I have found is you can dig so far and you come up. It's like the story of Demetrius Phaleron, the librarian. Oh, he died of a snake bite. And there's been so many times when the first avenue was a false path, and then the right path came out afterwards. So we've seen this time and time again. There's duplication all the way through the whole story. You know, there's a righteous line and there's another line as well. And you know, it's very easy to get mislaid onto the wrong path. You've got to dig a little bit deeper and keep persevering to find what the truth really is. And that's all I can say really to anyone who's wanting to do that.
Yeah, and I think central to your discussion here today, Malcolm, is this writing of Epiphanius. I think that's very core to the understanding of the legitimacy of the Septuagint and its history, and particularly the 2 letters that came through that Epiphanius is willing to set forth, you know, word for word. And so I do think that we do have a long trip ahead of us to Cyprus. So just, you know, put that on the back burner. As soon as we get through World War III, we'll make this trip to Cyprus.
Yeah, we can look for better times.
Yeah,
but this is fantastic, and thank you for having me on here. And I hope you found it interesting.
It's fantastic. I mean, your PowerPoint is extraordinary, and your teaching was extraordinary. And this is something we're going to have to share more in public.
It's a work in progress, because there's more to come, I'm sure, on this. We're going to find out more truths that are going to come our way. I'm quite certain.
We've actually got about 7 weeks worth or more of programming that we can do with Malcolm. I was trying to find all the list. I can't. We've had too many correspondences between us, so I can't find that. But, you know, there's a part 2 to this next week. So This has been phenomenal. It really has been fantastic teaching, because remember, we're used to a poor line theology for so long, and now you're introducing us to something that shows us the truth, how I started, that we've been duped, that we've been deceived. So we have to find out why and correct that. And we are that generation. For sure, we are that generation. We are the generation that will see Yahushua come back, and we are that generation to reveal these truths. And it's people like you and you that are going to assemble and speak to the remnant, and from there they will grow and they will learn, because the authorities, the assemblies, they're not saying the right things. And so now people are refusing to listen. They know that there's more. So this is really exciting. I want to thank you both, because it gives you a comprehension for the Sefer, for the extra biblical books and other books like the Sefer. It's not only just about the Sefer, but it's very rare, you know, and that's why I asked my question at the end, because now that gives us an appreciation for this compilation that we knew just as extended books in the library. And then you're authenticating a way we can understand Malcolm. So I want to thank you both, because together you're a really great duo with what's come out today. And this is definitely where we needed to be for answers for our time. And I can see yourself, John Halem, Tony Wright, other people coming on board that, you know, we're going in a specific direction. So this is really, really exciting in my spirit. So thank you, gentlemen, for that. And I do have to apologize because I got the time wrong. We went on a little bit longer, but it was important that we did. So I just want to end and release you all. And this is from Jeremiah chapter 8, verses 8 to 9 from the Sefer. How do ye say we are wise, and the Torah of Yahuwah is with us? Lo, certainly the lying pen of the scribes has made it a lie. The wise men are ashamed, they are dismayed and taken. Lo, they have rejected the word of Yahuwah, and what wisdom is in them. Amen. Describes everything you both have been speaking today. So again, I just want to thank you for this first injection of what is truly exciting. Thank you for coming on this program. Thank you, Dr. Pidgeon, as well.
You bet. It's been fantastic. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you for sharing this. And keep this in mind.
Just to say that Epiphanius and Esdras are our two witnesses on this. So if anyone had any doubt over these extra biblical books, you've got the answer right there. Thank you.
Outstanding. All right. And keep in mind that we're probably going to be doing a conference. We're hoping to establish a conference for the spring feasts in Cornwall. Now, we haven't definitely landed on the situs or that this is for sure going to happen, but we're very excited about the idea. And of course, we want all the presenters who are here on this program to come down and present there publicly, because it's going to be a week-long festival. And we're going to have multiple teachers and multiple teaching to go through this to really unveil the hidden truth of Scripture. And to unveil that for such a time as this in the spring feast, I think it would be absolutely spectacular.
Wonderful. And on that, we say to you, you have entered into the kingdom for a time such as this. We shall see you on Tuesday. Take care, everyone.
2, 3, and... Kadosh, Kadosh, Echad Yisrael, Baruch Shemo